24 years ago, the world watched in horror as towers fell and the Pentagon burned. But what we didn't know then was that September 11th wasn't just the end of one era. It was the beginning of America's longest war. A conflict that would consume over $8 trillion when you count combat costs, VA medical care, Homeland security expansion, and interest on war debt. A war that would claim approximately 900,000 direct deaths across multiple theaters and reshape global politics forever. Among the 2,977 people who died that morning were Christine Hansen, just 2 years old, and Robert Norton, age 85, the youngest and oldest victims of an attack that would define the next quarter century. Today, with nearly 24 years of hindsight, we can finally see the full scope of what that single morning unleashed. But to understand how we got here, we must first return to those final moments before everything changed. The morning that changed everything. At 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time, the world split into before and after. American Airlines Flight 11, carrying 92 people, struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center between floors 93 and 99. The Boeing 767, loaded with 10,000 gallons of jet fuel bound for Los Angeles, tore through steel and concrete like paper. In that instant, 1,344 people above the impact zone found themselves trapped as all 3 stairwells were severed. They had arrived early for work on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. For 17 agonizing minutes, Americans watched smoke pour from the North Tower, many still believing they were witnessing a terrible accident. Then United Airlines Flight 175 appeared on live television, banking sharply toward the South Tower. At 9:03 a.m., the second Boeing 767 struck between floors 77 and 85, eliminating any doubt that America was under coordinated attack. The fireball that erupted from the South Tower was broadcast into homes across the nation, searing the image into collective memory. The 19 hijackers had exploited vulnerabilities that seemed almost quaint in hindsight. They carried box cutters and utility knives that sailed through security checkpoints designed to catch guns and bombs, not improvised weapons. Airport screeners, many earning minimum wage with just hours of training, processed millions of travelers using metal detectors that couldn't detect ceramic blades. The attackers knew that cockpit doors remained unlocked during flight, that pilots were trained to comply with hijacker demands, and that air traffic controllers had no protocols for multiple simultaneous hijackings. Their preparation had been meticulous. Mohammed Atta and his cell had lived among ordinary Americans for months, attending flight schools in Florida and blending into suburban communities. They chose transcontinental flights departing for the West Coast because those planes carried maximum fuel loads. They selected Tuesday morning departures when business travelers filled the cabins with passengers less likely to resist. The timing was calculated to maximize television coverage as the attacks unfolded during peak morning news hours. Communication failures amplified the catastrophe at every level. The New York Police Department and Fire Department operated on incompatible radio systems, preventing coordination between first responders rushing into the towers. The Port Authority's emergency communication system failed when the first tower collapsed. FBI headquarters learned of the second crash from CNN, not from their own field offices. The Federal Aviation Administration struggled to track hijacked aircraft as radar signatures disappeared and transponders went silent. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 completed the attack on the nation's capital, slamming into the Pentagon's west side and penetrating 3 of the building's 5 concentric rings. The impact killed 125 Pentagon employees and all 64 people aboard the aircraft. In the skies above Pennsylvania, passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 had learned of the other attacks through cell phone calls. Their revolt against the hijackers ended with the plane crashing in a field near Shanksville at 10:03 a.m., likely preventing a 4th strike on the Capitol or White House. The heroism of first responders became legendary. but the hidden costs would emerge over decades. Of the 411 emergency workers who died that day, 343 were firefighters and 71 were law enforcement officers. However, the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund has now certified over 4,000 deaths linked to toxic exposure from the attacks. More than 115,000 people have registered health conditions related to their presence at Ground Zero, the Pentagon, or the Shanksville crash site. Respiratory diseases, cancers, and other illnesses continue claiming lives more than 2 decades later. Financial markets collapsed within minutes of the first impact. The New York Stock Exchange suspended trading indefinitely. The Federal Reserve pumped billions of dollars into the banking system to prevent complete economic meltdown. Lower Manhattan's financial district, the symbol of American economic power, lay buried under tons of debris and toxic dust. The immediate economic impact reached $60 billion in New York City alone, with ripple effects spreading across global markets. President Bush, reading to elementary school children in Florida when the attacks began, spent crucial hours aboard Air Force One as the government struggled to coordinate its response. Vice President Cheney rushed to a bunker beneath the White House, authorized military aircraft to shoot down any hijacked planes that threatened Washington. For the first time in American history, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered every aircraft in U.S. airspace to land immediately, grounding over 4,500 flights. The world watched America's vulnerability exposed in real time. NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history, declaring the attacks an assault on all member nations. Russia offered unprecedented cooperation in intelligence sharing. Even traditional adversaries like Iran and Cuba condemned the attacks and offered assistance. The final death toll reached 2,977 innocent victims from 90 different countries. The youngest was Christine Hansen, age 2, aboard United Flight 175. The oldest was Robert Norton, 85, on American Flight 11. Among the dead were stockbrokers and janitors, CEOs and food service workers, people who had simply gone to work on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. As rescue workers sifted through the rubble and investigators began piecing together the timeline, one name emerged from the intelligence chatter with chilling clarity. The mastermind behind this unprecedented attack was already known to American intelligence agencies, but knowing who was responsible and finding him would prove to be entirely different challenges. The hunt for bin Laden begins. Osama bin Laden's name dominated every classified briefing within hours of the towers falling. Phone intercepts captured celebratory conversations between known Al-Qaeda operatives. Financial records traced the hijackers' funding back to the same terrorist network that had bombed American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 3 years earlier. Yet for all this certainty about who had orchestrated the attacks, American intelligence had no reliable information about where the world's most wanted man was hiding. President Bush signed the authorization for military force against those responsible for 9/11 just 3 days after the attacks. The Pentagon immediately began moving naval vessels toward the Arabian Sea, while special operations forces prepared for deployment to a landlocked country most Americans couldn't locate on a map. On October 7th, exactly 26 days after the Twin Towers fell, Operation Enduring Freedom commenced with cruise missile strikes against Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets across Afghanistan. The Taliban's refusal to surrender bin Laden transformed what began as a terrorist manhunt into a full-scale invasion. Mullah Omar, the Taliban's supreme leader, dismissed American ultimatums and declared that his government would never betray their honored guest. This decision sealed Afghanistan's fate and guaranteed that American forces would face not just Al-Qaeda terrorists, but an entire government apparatus protecting them. The Northern Alliance provided America's entry point into Afghan tribal politics. This coalition of ethnic Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras controlled roughly 10% of Afghanistan's territory. American Special Forces teams embedded with Northern Alliance fighters, coordinating devastating airstrikes that shattered Taliban defensive lines. Within weeks, the alliance had captured Kabul while Taliban forces retreated toward the Pakistani border. These early victories masked intelligence failures that would define the entire conflict. At Tora Bora in December 2001, American forces cornered bin Laden and his closest associates in a network of caves along Afghanistan's eastern border. Local Afghan militias, paid by the CIA to seal escape routes, instead accepted larger bribes from Al-Qaeda fighters. Poor communication between American military units and their Afghan allies created gaps in the cordon. Insufficient numbers of American ground troops meant the operation depended entirely on unreliable local forces with their own agendas. Logistics of projecting military power 7,000 miles from American shores staggered military planners. Every bullet, every meal, every drop of fuel had to travel through a supply chain that stretched across multiple countries in hostile territory. Pakistan provided the primary corridor for supplies, giving Islamabad enormous leverage over American operations. The cost of transporting a gallon of fuel to remote Afghan outposts reached $400 per gallon by 2010. At peak deployment in 2010, over 100,000 American troops occupied Afghanistan, supported by an additional 40,000 NATO forces. The logistics network employed over 70,000 private contractors, many of them local Afghans whose loyalty shifted with payment schedules. Monthly operating costs exceeded $6.7 billion. The Pentagon established over 800 bases and outposts across Afghanistan, each requiring constant resupply and protection. Afghan tribal dynamics confounded American strategists who had expected clear battle lines between friends and enemies. Village elders played multiple sides, accepting American development funds while secretly supporting Taliban fighters. Provincial governors installed by the new Afghan government often commanded less respect than local warlords who had fought the Soviets 20 years earlier. American forces found themselves mediating land disputes, ethnic rivalries, and blood feuds that predated the founding of the United States. The mission expanded far beyond capturing bin Laden as military commanders confronted the reality of governing a failed state. American forces began training Afghan police, building schools, and constructing roads in regions that had never seen paved surfaces. Provincial reconstruction teams combined military personnel with development specialists who distributed billions in aid money. The Pentagon established the Commander's Emergency Response Program, giving field commanders discretionary funds to win hearts and minds through local infrastructure projects. These nation-building efforts created their own momentum and constituencies within the American government. The State Department opened dozens of provincial offices. The CIA recruited thousands of local informants who required ongoing protection and payment. Military contractors built permanent facilities designed to support long-term operations. Each expansion of the mission created stakeholders with vested interests in continued American presence. Strategic decisions made in those first crucial months haunted American policy for decades. The choice to work with Northern Alliance commanders gave undue influence to ethnic minorities who comprised less than half of Afghanistan's population. The decision to disband Taliban military units, rather than integrating them into a new national army, created thousands of experienced fighters with grievances against the new government. Intelligence agencies struggled to track Al-Qaeda's scattered leadership as they dispersed across the ungoverned regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Drone surveillance revealed constant movement between safe houses, but pinpointing specific individuals required human intelligence that took years to develop. The CIA established new bases in countries surrounding Afghanistan, but cooperation with local intelligence services came with political costs that complicated diplomatic relationships. By 2003, bin Laden had vanished completely from American intelligence radar. Intercepted communications suggested he remained alive, but his operational role appeared minimal. Al-Qaeda had fractured into regional affiliates operating independently across multiple continents. Yet American forces remained committed to Afghanistan, now pursuing objectives that bore little resemblance to the original mission. What had begun as a manhunt for the architect of 9/11 was becoming something entirely different and far more complex than anyone had imagined. Mission creep, from counter-terrorism to nation-building. The Taliban government collapsed faster than anyone anticipated, but American commanders quickly discovered that military victory was just the beginning of an impossible puzzle. Afghanistan lay in ruins after decades of war, first against the Soviets, then through years of civil conflict between competing factions. No functioning government existed outside Kabul. Most provinces had no electricity, no paved roads, no hospitals, no schools. The country possessed virtually no infrastructure that modern militaries could use to maintain their presence or that civilian populations needed to survive. American forces found themselves governing a nation of 25 million people scattered across terrain that ranged from desert valleys to mountain peaks reaching 24,000 feet. The Pentagon had trained for combat operations, not for rebuilding collapsed societies. Soldiers accustomed to destroying enemy positions suddenly became mayors, judges, and development coordinators in villages where residents spoke languages most Americans had never heard. Military commanders discovered that defeating the Taliban required replacing them with something that Afghans would accept as legitimate authority. The cultural complexities overwhelmed American personnel at every level. Afghan society operated according to tribal codes that prioritized family loyalty over national identity. Village elders commanded more respect than officials appointed by the new government in Kabul. Women remained largely excluded from public life despite American efforts to promote gender equality. Religious traditions shaped daily routines in ways that conflicted with American military schedules and operational requirements. Local disputes over water rights, grazing lands, and ancient blood feuds became American problems when violence disrupted military operations. Provincial reconstruction teams attempted to bridge the gap between military objectives and civilian needs. These units combined soldiers, diplomats, and development specialists who distributed billions in aid money for projects ranging from well digging to road construction. The teams built schools that often remained empty because parents feared sending children to institutions associated with foreign occupiers. They constructed clinics that struggled to find qualified medical staff willing to work in areas controlled by American forces. The financial commitment to rebuilding Afghanistan reached staggering proportions. Between 2001 and 2022, the United States spent an estimated $2.3 trillion on military operations and reconstruction efforts in the Afghanistan and Pakistan region, adjusted for inflation. This figure encompassed direct military costs, veteran medical care, equipment replacement, infrastructure development, and interest payments on borrowed funds. Annual spending peaked at over $100 billion during the height of the surge operations, exceeding the entire gross domestic product of most countries. Corruption within the Afghan government systematically undermined every reconstruction effort. President Hamid Karzai's administration became notorious for diverting international aid money into private accounts. Provincial governors demanded bribes for basic government services. Police commanders sold weapons provided by American taxpayers to Taliban insurgents. Construction contracts awarded through competitive bidding often went to companies owned by relatives of government officials. American auditors estimated that corruption consumed at least 40% of all development funds, though the actual figure likely reached much higher levels. The growing insurgency exploited American missteps and Afghan grievances with devastating effectiveness. Taliban fighters who had initially fled to Pakistan began returning to contest American control over rural districts. They recruited from populations angered by civilian casualties from American airstrikes, by night raids that violated cultural taboos, and by the presence of foreign soldiers in conservative Muslim communities. Improvised explosive devices targeted American supply convoys, making every trip outside secure bases a potentially lethal mission. American military doctrine emphasized winning hearts and minds, but operational requirements often contradicted this goal. Soldiers conducting house searches for suspected insurgents alienated families even when they found nothing suspicious. Checkpoint procedures that prevented suicide bombers also prevented Afghan civilians from conducting normal business activities. Cultural misunderstandings escalated into violent confrontations that created new enemies faster than military operations could eliminate existing ones. Military personnel bore the physical and psychological costs of prolonged deployments to environments where distinguishing friends from enemies proved nearly impossible. Combat tour, originally planned for 6 months, extended to 12 months, then to 15 months as personnel shortages mounted. Soldiers completed multiple deployments with inadequate time between rotations to recover from the stress of constant vigilance and frequent combat. The suicide rate among active duty military personnel increased dramatically as repeated deployments strained marriages, separated families, and exposed troops to traumatic experiences. American military deaths in Afghanistan totaled 2,354 personnel, including 1,847 killed in hostile action and 507 who died from accidents, illness, or other non-combat causes. An additional 20,149 American service members suffered wounds requiring medical evacuation from the theater of operations. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than battlefield casualties. More than 200,000 American veterans received diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder following service in post-9/11 conflicts. Veteran suicide rates exceeded civilian rates by significant margins, with 6,392 veterans taking their own lives between 2020 and 2021 alone. Afghan civilian casualties mounted steadily as the insurgency intensified and American forces responded with increasing firepower. Airstrikes intended to eliminate Taliban commanders often killed wedding parties, farmers, and families whose only crime was living in contested areas. These civilian deaths fueled anti-American sentiment that provided recruitment opportunities for insurgent groups. Each mistaken bombing created dozens of new enemies, determined to expel foreign forces from their homeland. By 2005, American leaders confronted an uncomfortable reality. The United States had committed itself to a generational conflict with objectives that seemed to expand rather than narrow over time. The original mission of capturing Osama bin Laden had evolved into rebuilding an entire society according to Western democratic principles. Yet even as commanders requested additional troops and resources for Afghanistan, the White House was already contemplating an even more ambitious military intervention that would fundamentally alter America's strategic position in the Middle East. The Iraq diversion, how one war became two. On March 20, 2003, cruise missiles struck Baghdad, opening a second front that would split American military focus across two distant theaters of war. This expansion transformed what began as a targeted hunt for the perpetrators of 9/11 into the largest military commitment since Vietnam. The choice to invade Iraq while still fighting in Afghanistan represented a fundamental shift in strategy that would consume American resources for the next 2 decades. Intelligence agencies presented their case for invasion with absolute certainty. Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations Security Council on February 5, 2003, displaying satellite photographs and audio recordings that supposedly proved Saddam Hussein possessed chemical and biological weapons. The presentation included detailed claims about mobile biological weapons laboratories, aluminium tubes for nuclear centrifuges, and stockpiles of anthrax and nerve agents. Intelligence officials testified that Iraq could deploy chemical weapons within 45 minutes of receiving orders. These assessments painted a picture of imminent threat that demanded immediate military action. The weapons of mass destruction never materialized. American forces conducted exhaustive searches across Iraq, interviewing scientists, examining suspected sites, and following every intelligence lead. The Iraq Survey Group, led by weapons inspector David Kay, concluded definitively that Iraq had abandoned its WMD programs in the 1990s. No chemical weapons stockpiles existed. No biological weapons laboratories operated. No nuclear weapons program had resumed after international sanctions ended it years earlier. The intelligence that justified war had been fundamentally wrong. Military resources shifted dramatically from Afghanistan to support the Iraq invasion. Special operations forces trained in Pashto and Dari languages found themselves reassigned to cities where Arabic dialects dominated. Intelligence assets focused on tracking former Ba'ath Party officials instead of monitoring Taliban communications networks. The 10th Mountain Division, which had been hunting Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghan mountains, redeployed to patrol Iraqi urban neighborhoods. Equipment designed for high-altitude operations moved to desert environments with completely different tactical requirements. The initial invasion succeeded with stunning speed, but strategic miscalculations transformed military victory into prolonged occupation. Pentagon planners expected Iraqi military units to surrender en masse and transition into supporting coalition forces. Instead, Saddam's army dissolved into civilian populations, taking their weapons and expertise with them. American forces found themselves governing a nation of 25 million people with no functioning government institutions, no reliable police force, and no administrative structure capable of maintaining basic services. Paul Bremer's Coalition Provisional Authority made decisions that guaranteed insurgency. Order Number 1 disbanded the entire Iraqi military, putting 385,000 trained soldiers out of work while leaving them armed and angry. Order Number 2 removed all Ba'ath Party members from government positions, eliminating the only people with experience running Iraqi institutions. These policies created hundreds of thousands of unemployed men with military training who blamed Americans for destroying their livelihoods and social status. Sectarian violence erupted as Sunni and Shia Muslims settled scores that had festered under Saddam's authoritarian rule. Car bombings targeted Shia neighborhoods in Baghdad. Sunni mosques faced retaliatory attacks. Militias controlled entire districts, imposing their own justice systems and extracting tribute from residents. Death squads operated with impunity, often using police vehicles and uniforms provided by American forces. Bodies appeared daily in Baghdad streets, victims of sectarian killings that pushed Iraq towards civil war. Fighting on two fronts stretched American military capabilities beyond their design limits. The Pentagon had planned force structures assuming major combat operations in one theater while maintaining deterrent presence elsewhere. Iraq and Afghanistan demanded simultaneous large-scale deployments separated by 1,500 miles of hostile territory. Combat tour extended from 6 months to 12 months, then to 15 months as personnel shortages mounted. National Guard and Reserve units activated repeatedly, disrupting civilian careers and family stability. Financial costs escalated exponentially as both conflicts expanded. The costs of war project at Brown University calculated total expenditures at $8 trillion for post-9/11 military operations through 2025. This figure encompasses direct war appropriations, veteran medical care, equipment replacement, base operations, and interest payments on borrowed funds. Peak annual spending reached $200 billion when both wars operated simultaneously, exceeding the defense budgets of most NATO allies combined. The Iraq invasion inadvertently created the very insurgencies America would spend the next decade fighting. Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged from the chaos following Saddam's removal, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and composed largely of foreign fighters drawn by the opportunity to kill Americans. This organization evolved into the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which eventually controlled territory larger than Great Britain and declared a caliphate that attracted recruits worldwide. By 2006, America found itself simultaneously fighting Taliban insurgents in Afghanistan and multiple armed groups in Iraq. The original mission of capturing Osama bin Laden had expanded into nation-building projects across two countries with different languages, cultures, and political systems. Military commanders requested additional troops for both theaters, while civilian officials struggled to explain why American soldiers remained committed to conflicts that seemed to generate new enemies faster than military operations could eliminate them. The situation in Iraq had deteriorated so dramatically that it threatened to unravel everything American forces had sacrificed to achieve. The surge and counterinsurgency. General David Petraeus arrived in Baghdad in February 2007 with a mandate to implement the most comprehensive strategic overhaul since the invasion began. His counterinsurgency manual emphasized that success required winning popular support by providing security, essential services, and legitimate governance. American forces would abandon their fortress-like forward operating bases and establish small outposts in Iraqi neighborhoods. Soldiers would patrol on foot, shop in local markets, and drink tea with tribal elders instead of conducting raids based on intelligence reports. The strategy demanded cultural sensitivity and language skills that most American units lacked after years of conventional combat operations. The surge strategy announced in January 2007 committed an additional 30,000 American troops to Iraq, bringing total forces to over 160,000 personnel. 5 additional brigade combat teams deployed to Baghdad, while 2 more reinforced Anbar province, where Sunni insurgents had declared an Islamic State. Each brigade required thousands of support personnel, contractors, and equipment that strained supply lines already operating at maximum capacity. The financial cost of maintaining surge operations reached $12 billion per month, not including long-term medical care for wounded veterans. Similar counterinsurgency principles applied to Afghanistan, where American forces attempted to replicate Iraqi tactical successes in completely different terrain and cultural conditions. The Afghan surge peaked at over 100,000 American troops supported by 40,000 coalition partners. Combined operations in both theaters required 200,000 American military personnel deployed simultaneously, the largest overseas commitment since World War II. Military families endured repeated deployments with inadequate recovery time between combat tour. The new strategy required soldiers to act as diplomats, development specialists, and police officers while maintaining their combat effectiveness. Infantry units established joint security stations in Iraqi neighborhoods, sharing facilities with local police and Iraqi army units. American commanders distributed reconstruction funds directly to tribal leaders who promised to maintain security in their territories. These payments, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars, created dependency relationships that collapsed when funding ended or American units rotated home. Tribal politics determined the success or failure of counterinsurgency operations more than military tactics. Sunni tribal leaders in Anbar province agreed to cooperate with American forces only after Al-Qaeda in Iraq began executing sheikhs who refused to follow their extreme interpretation of Islamic law. The Sunni Awakening movement provided 100,000 armed men who switched sides and began fighting their former allies. American forces paid these fighters $300 per month, creating a security arrangement that depended entirely on continued American funding and presence. Personal relationships between individual American officers and Iraqi leaders often determined whether entire districts remained peaceful or erupted in violence. Captain Travis Patriquin of the 1st Armored Division became legendary for his ability to negotiate with Sunni tribes in Ramadi, speaking Arabic and understanding local customs well enough to broker ceasefires between competing factions. His death in a roadside bombing demonstrated how much the strategy depended on irreplaceable individuals rather than sustainable institutional relationships. Iraqi civilian casualties decreased significantly during the surge period, falling from over 3,000 deaths per month in late 2006 to fewer than 500 deaths per month by early 2008. American military deaths also declined as Iraqi cooperation improved intelligence collection and reduced insurgent safe havens. These tactical improvements created space for political negotiations between Sunni and Shia leaders who had been fighting a low-level civil war since 2004. Drone warfare emerged as a critical supplement to ground operations during this period, providing persistent surveillance and precision strikes that reduced risks to American personnel. The Pentagon operated fewer than 50 armed drones in 2007, but this number increased to over 200 by 2010 as commanders recognized their effectiveness in tracking high-value targets across multiple countries. Drone operations required massive intelligence infrastructure, including analysts, linguists, and technical specialists who processed video feeds and communications intercepts around the clock. The surge achieved tactical objectives that proved strategically meaningless once American forces withdrew. Violence declined temporarily, while American troops maintained intensive patrolling schedules and provided financial incentives for cooperation. However, the underlying political problems that had caused the insurgency remained unresolved. Sunni-Shia tensions, Kurdish independence aspirations, and competition for oil revenues continued to destabilize Iraqi society long after the last American combat units departed. Military effectiveness during the surge demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of American power projection. Highly trained professional soldiers could establish temporary security in the most dangerous environments when supported by unlimited resources and political commitment. However, these tactical successes could not resolve fundamental conflicts within Iraqi society or create legitimate governance institutions that functioned without foreign support. While American forces celebrated reduced violence and improved cooperation from Iraqi tribes, the original architect of 9/11 remained at large nearly a decade after the attacks. Intelligence agencies had scattered their resources across two massive theaters of war, but the painstaking work of tracking individual terrorists continued in the shadows, following leads that seemed to disappear into Pakistan's tribal regions, where no amount of conventional military force could guarantee success. The Bin Laden raid, justice after a decade. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. CIA analysts had spent years tracking a courier known only by his nom de guerre, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. Intelligence reports suggested this man served as Bin Laden's most trusted messenger, but his real identity remained a mystery. Pakistani agents provided fragmentary information about phone calls and movements. Detainees at Guantanamo Bay mentioned the courier's nickname during interrogations, though many gave false information to satisfy their questioners. The painstaking work of connecting these scattered pieces took nearly a decade. In August 2010, surveillance teams identified al-Kuwaiti's real name as Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed and tracked him to a telephone call made from the Peshawar region. Electronic intercepts revealed he was using extreme operational security, changing phones frequently and never mentioning his employer's name. When Pakistani intelligence followed his white Suzuki truck through the crowded streets of Abbottabad, they discovered he lived inside a mysterious walled compound that stood out dramatically from surrounding residences. The Abbottabad compound violated every principle of how wealthy Pakistanis typically designed their homes. 3 stories tall with 18-foot walls topped with barbed wire, it contained no telephone lines, no internet connections, and no cable television. The residents burned their trash instead of putting it out for collection. Upper floor windows had been bricked up to prevent surveillance. The compound housed 2 families, but contained security measures that suggested someone inside feared for his life. Months of surveillance revealed behavioral patterns that intrigued intelligence analysts. A tall man appeared occasionally in the compound's vegetable garden, walking back and forth along the same path for exercise. The figure wore a distinctive hat and moved with deliberation that suggested advanced age. Satellite imagery could not confirm his identity, but the man's height and bearing matched descriptions of Osama bin Laden. CIA officials estimated their confidence at only 60%, but this represented the strongest lead they had developed in nearly 10 years. President Obama convened multiple National Security Council meetings to evaluate military options. The compound's location in Abbottabad, just 35 miles from Islamabad and home to Pakistan's premier military academy, complicated any potential operation. Pakistani forces maintained significant military presence in the area, including helicopter squadrons that could intercept American aircraft. The compound's thick walls and unknown interior layout made precision bombing impossible without risking civilian casualties in surrounding neighborhoods. The CIA constructed a replica compound at a classified location in North Carolina where Navy SEALs rehearsed the raid repeatedly. Each training exercise tested different scenarios. What if Pakistani forces responded immediately? What if the target wasn't present? What if the helicopters crashed during insertion? The SEALs practiced moving through the compound's rooms in complete darkness, identifying potential threats and extracting sensitive materials under extreme time pressure. Operation Neptune Spear launched from Jalalabad, Afghanistan on the night of May 1, 2011. Two specially modified Black Hawk helicopters carried 24 Navy SEALs across the Pakistani border without authorization from Islamabad. The aircraft flew at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, using terrain-following navigation systems that allowed them to hug mountainous geography. Pakistani air defenses never detected the incursion, though the helicopters passed within miles of several military installations. The first helicopter encountered unexpected aerodynamic conditions caused by the compound's high walls and crash-landed in the courtyard, though no personnel suffered serious injuries. SEALs immediately established security perimeters while their teammates began clearing the compound room by room. They encountered armed resistance on the first floor, killing 2 men before advancing to upper levels, where intelligence suggested the primary target lived with his family. The SEALs identified bin Laden on the compound's 3rd floor within 15 minutes of touching down. The world's most wanted man appeared unarmed but moved toward a weapon when the Americans entered his bedroom. A Navy SEAL fired multiple shots, killing bin Laden instantly while his wife and children watched in terror. The operators immediately photographed the body and collected DNA samples for genetic confirmation of his identity. While combat teams secured the compound, other SEALs gathered intelligence materials that filled multiple helicopters. They collected over 100 storage devices, including computers, hard drives, flash drives, and DVDs that contained Al-Qaeda's operational plans, financial records, and communications with affiliate organizations worldwide. Documents revealed ongoing plots against American targets and provided unprecedented insight into the terrorist organization's structure and capabilities. President Obama announced bin Laden's death in a televised address that reached global audiences within hours. Crowds gathered outside the White House and at Ground Zero in New York, celebrating the news that justice had finally been served. Families of 9/11 victims expressed relief and closure, though many noted that bin Laden's death could never restore their lost loved ones. The intelligence materials recovered from Abbottabad revealed that Al-Qaeda had fractured into numerous regional affiliates that operated independently of bin Laden's direct control. Organizations in Yemen, Somalia, North Africa, and Southeast Asia had developed their own leadership structures, funding sources, and operational capabilities. Killing bin Laden eliminated a powerful symbolic figure, but did not destroy the decentralized network he had created. The successful raid raised fundamental questions about the war on terror's continued necessity and scope. Bin Laden's death satisfied the primary objective that had justified the invasion of Afghanistan 10 years earlier. However, American forces remained deployed across multiple countries, fighting organizations that had emerged from the chaos of prolonged conflict. Even as Americans celebrated this long-awaited victory, intelligence agencies were already tracking disturbing reports of a new terrorist organization emerging from the ruins of Iraq that would prove far more brutal than anything Al-Qaeda had ever attempted. ISIS and the new face of terror. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi seized this opportunity to build something far more dangerous than traditional terrorist cells. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, known as ISIS or ISIL, grew from Al-Qaeda's Iraqi remnants, but quickly surpassed its predecessor in brutality, territorial ambition, and global recruitment. Where Al-Qaeda operated in shadows and struck symbolic targets, ISIS conquered cities, governed populations, and broadcast their atrocities with professional production values that shocked intelligence analysts worldwide. The power vacuum left by departing American forces in December 2011 created perfect conditions for ISIS expansion. Iraqi Prime Minister Nuri al-Maliki's Shia-dominated government systematically excluded Sunni Muslims from political participation, military leadership, and economic opportunities. Sunni tribal leaders who had cooperated with American forces during the surge found themselves marginalized and persecuted by their own government. Former Ba'ath Party officials and Iraqi military officers, many imprisoned or dismissed after the 2003 invasion, provided ISIS with experienced leadership and tactical expertise that transformed grievances into military capability. In June 2014, ISIS fighters captured Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, after Iraqi army units abandoned their positions without fighting. The militants seized American-supplied weapons, vehicles, and equipment worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Within weeks, they controlled territory stretching from eastern Syria to western Iraq, encompassing an area larger than Great Britain, containing over 8 million residents. This rapid territorial expansion demonstrated the complete collapse of institutions that American forces had spent years building and billions of dollars supporting. The self-declared caliphate represented something unprecedented in modern terrorism. ISIS established government ministries, collected taxes, operated schools, and administered justice according to their extreme interpretation of Islamic law. They printed currency, issued passports, and maintained oil production facilities that generated millions in daily revenue. This territorial control distinguished ISIS from every previous terrorist organization and attracted foreign fighters who wanted to join a functioning Islamic State rather than merely conduct attacks against Western targets. Their propaganda machine exploited social media platforms with sophistication that intelligence agencies struggled to counter. ISIS produced high-definition videos that combined religious messaging with Hollywood-style cinematography. Execution videos showed prisoners in orange jumpsuits being beheaded, burned alive, or drowned in steel cages, while cameras captured every moment from multiple angles. These productions served dual purposes: terrorizing enemies while attracting recruits who craved participation in apocalyptic violence. Foreign fighter recruitment reached levels that surpassed even the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s. An estimated 40,000 individuals from over 120 countries traveled to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS between 2013 and 2018. European citizens abandoned comfortable lives to participate in mass executions. American converts drove across the Turkish border to enlist in genocide against Yazidi minorities. Social media algorithms amplified ISIS content to users searching for purpose, belonging, or religious guidance, creating recruitment pathways that traditional counter-terrorism methods could not intercept. The international response required unprecedented coordination between nations that rarely agreed on Middle Eastern policy. The United States formed a coalition of 68 countries committed to degrading and ultimately destroying ISIS. Operation Inherent Resolve began with airstrikes against ISIS positions in Iraq on August 8, 2014, expanding to Syria the following month. The campaign eventually conducted over 34,000 airstrikes across both countries, costing American taxpayers $9.4 million per day at its peak intensity. Military commanders faced tactical challenges that differed dramatically from previous counter-terrorism operations. ISIS fighters embedded themselves in civilian populations, using hospitals and schools as military headquarters. They booby-trapped entire neighborhoods with improvised explosive devices before retreating, making urban warfare extraordinarily dangerous for advancing forces. The group's use of suicide vehicle-borne explosives and armored bulldozers, filled with bombs, forced coalition forces to develop new defensive techniques and equipment. The humanitarian catastrophe created by ISIS rule shocked international observers. The group enslaved thousands of Yazidi women and girls, selling them in markets like livestock. They executed captured soldiers and civilians in mass graves containing hundreds of bodies. Christians faced forced conversion or death. Homosexuals were thrown from tall buildings while crowds cheered below. UNESCO heritage sites dating back thousands of years were destroyed with sledgehammers and bulldozers in carefully filmed propaganda events. American ground forces returned to Iraq in 2014, despite President Obama's promises that combat operations had ended permanently. Special operations teams trained Iraqi security forces while providing targeting intelligence for coalition airstrikes. The number of American military personnel in Iraq grew from 0 to over 5,000 as the anti-ISIS campaign expanded. Additional forces deployed to Syria despite legal complications arising from that country's ongoing civil war. The battle for Mosul from October 2016 to July 2017 represented the largest urban warfare operation since World War II. Iraqi security forces, supported by coalition advisors and airstrikes, fought block by block through a city where ISIS had prepared defenses for over 2 years. The 9-month battle left much of Iraq's second-largest city in ruins while displacing over 900,000 residents. Coalition forces declared ISIS territorially defeated in March 2019 when Syrian Democratic Forces captured the group's last stronghold in Baghouz, Syria. However, thousands of fighters had already dispersed into desert hideouts or returned to their home countries, carrying combat experience and extremist ideology. The organization's ability to inspire violence remotely demonstrated that territorial defeat had not eliminated the movement's global reach. Even as coalition forces celebrated victory over ISIS, American military commitments continued expanding across multiple theaters. The longest war in American history remained unresolved, with no clear path toward withdrawal from Afghanistan. After 2 decades of combat operations, political leaders faced mounting pressure to justify continued military presence in conflicts that seemed to generate new enemies faster than they could eliminate existing ones. The Afghanistan withdrawal, America's longest war, ends. By April 2021, President Biden faced a decision that would define his presidency and America's global credibility. The images that flashed across television screens worldwide on August 30, 2021, defied comprehension. Thousands of desperate Afghans clung to the landing gear of American military aircraft as they taxied down Kabul airport's runway. Bodies fell from the sky as people lost their grip on planes climbing towards safety they would never reach. Mothers passed babies over razor wire to American soldiers, hoping strangers would give their children the future Afghanistan could no longer provide. After 20 years of war, America's longest military conflict was ending not with victory parades or ceremonial flag lowerings, but with scenes of chaos that shocked even veteran war correspondents. Biden's decision to complete the withdrawal by August 31, 2021, represented the fulfillment of a campaign promise that had broad public support. Polling consistently showed that over 70% of Americans wanted to end the Afghanistan commitment, viewing it as an expensive failure that had consumed resources without achieving meaningful progress. The Doha Agreement, signed by the Trump administration in February 2020, had already committed the United States to withdrawal, setting May 1, 2021 as the original deadline. Biden extended this timeline by several months, but the fundamental decision had been made before he took office. Military commanders warned that the Afghan government would likely collapse without continued American support, but few predicted the speed of this disintegration. The Afghan National Army, trained and equipped by American forces for 2 decades, possessed over 300,000 troops on paper and modern weapon systems worth billions of dollars. However, this impressive structure existed largely as an accounting fiction. Ghost soldiers appeared on payrolls while commanders pocketed their salaries. Units operated without adequate fuel, ammunition, or spare parts because corruption diverted logistics funds into private accounts. The Taliban's final offensive began in May 2021 and proceeded with stunning momentum across Afghanistan's rural districts. Afghan army units surrendered without fighting as Taliban negotiators offered safe passage to soldiers who abandoned their positions. Provincial capitals fell in rapid succession as government forces retreated toward Kabul. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country on August 15th with bags of cash, abandoning his government and military to face the Taliban advance alone. The 20-year effort to build a functioning Afghan state collapsed in less than 2 weeks. Kabul airport became the sole lifeline for foreign nationals and Afghans desperately seeking to escape Taliban rule. American forces controlled the airport while Taliban fighters secured the surrounding areas, creating a bizarre cooperation between enemies who had fought each other for decades. The evacuation operation, dubbed Operation Allies Refuge, faced impossible logistics as over 120,000 people needed transportation out of a single airfield under constant threat of terrorist attack. The suicide bombing at Abbey Gate on August 26, 2021, demonstrated the security nightmare facing evacuation operations. An Islamic State operative detonated an explosive vest in a crowd of Afghans waiting for evacuation flights, killing 170 Afghan civilians and 13 American service members. The dead Americans included 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, and 1 Army soldier, most of them barely old enough to remember the 9/11 attacks that had originally justified American presence in Afghanistan. Their deaths brought total American military fatalities in Afghanistan to 2,461, including 1,922 killed in hostile action. The humanitarian crisis that followed Taliban victory exceeded even pessimistic projections. The new government immediately banned women from most employment, closed girls' schools above elementary level, and prohibited women from traveling without male guardians. Public executions and floggings resumed in football stadiums, while the Taliban destroyed musical instruments and banned most forms of entertainment. International sanctions froze Afghanistan's financial assets, creating an economic collapse that pushed millions towards starvation. Afghan allies who had worked with American forces faced systematic reprisal despite Taliban promises of amnesty. Translators, drivers, security guards, and others who had supported coalition operations received death threats and assassination attempts. The special immigrant visa program, designed to protect these individuals, had processed fewer than half of pending applications when American forces departed. Thousands of Afghans who had risked their lives to help American soldiers found themselves trapped under Taliban rule with targets on their backs. The withdrawal's impact on American credibility became immediately apparent as allies questioned Washington's commitment to future security partnerships. European governments that had contributed troops to Afghanistan for 2 decades felt blindsided by the chaotic evacuation and rapid timeline for departure. Taiwan, South Korea, and other nations dependent on American security guarantees wondered whether they might face similar abandonment if supporting them became politically unpopular with American voters. more than 76,000 Afghan refugees have resettled in the United States since the withdrawal, joining diaspora communities across American cities. These evacuees included interpreters, military contractors, government employees, and others who had worked directly with American forces or agencies. However, thousands more remain in limbo at processing centers in Qatar, Kuwait, and other intermediate locations, while their visa applications undergo security reviews that can take months or years to complete. Question that haunts veterans, policymakers, and families of the fallen remains unanswered after nearly 4 years of reflection. Afghanistan today resembles the country American forces invaded in 2001, controlled by the same Taliban leadership that had provided sanctuary to Al-Qaeda before the 9/11 attacks. Yet the chaotic scenes from Kabul airport represented only the most visible conclusion to a conflict whose true dimensions remained largely hidden from public view. The true cost, counting lives and dollars. Behind these dramatic headlines lay numbers that revealed the true scope of America's response to September 11th. The Costs of War project at Brown University has documented between 897,000 and 929,000 direct deaths from violence across Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and other conflict zones where American forces operated after 2001. This staggering figure encompasses American military personnel, allied fighters, opposition forces, civilians, journalists, and humanitarian workers who died from bullets, bombs, and direct violence. Yet even this enormous death toll represents only the visible portion of the war on terror's human cost. The indirect consequences of prolonged warfare have proven even more devastating than combat deaths themselves. Researchers estimate that between 3.6 and 3.7 million additional people have died from the deterioration of economic, environmental, psychological, and health conditions in war zones. These deaths resulted from destroyed hospitals that could no longer treat patients, contaminated water systems that spread disease, economic collapse that created malnutrition, and psychological trauma that led to suicide and self-harm. Families fled their homes to escape violence, only to die in refugee camps from preventable diseases. Children grew up without adequate nutrition or medical care because war had shattered the infrastructure that sustained life. American military personnel paid an enormous price for their service in these conflicts. Official Pentagon statistics record 7,008 military deaths and 50,422 wounded in action across all war on terror operations through 2025. These figures include 2,461 American service members killed in Afghanistan, 4,431 who died in Iraq, and 109 fatalities from Operation Freedom's Sentinel. However, battlefield casualties tell only part of the story affecting American military families and communities. Veteran suicide rates reveal the psychological toll that extends far beyond physical wounds. The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that more than 17 veterans take their own lives each day, though independent research suggests this figure significantly underestimates the actual number. America's Warrior Partnership and Duke University released a study indicating that as many as 24 veterans die daily from suicide or self-injury, nearly 4 times the number killed in combat during the peak years of fighting. The 2023 National Veterans Suicide Prevention Annual Report documented an 11.6% increase in veteran suicides from 2020 to 2021, with female veterans experiencing a particularly alarming 24.1% jump in suicide rates during this same period. The financial costs of the war on terror have reached proportions that dwarf most government programs and rival the expense of major wars throughout American history. The United States has spent approximately $8 trillion on military operations, veteran care, homeland security, and related activities between 2001 and 2022. This massive expenditure includes direct war appropriations, increases to the Pentagon's base budget, State Department operations in conflict zones, veteran medical care, disability payments, Department of Homeland Security spending, and interest payments on borrowed funds used to finance these operations. Long-term medical and disability obligations represent the largest unfunded commitment arising from these conflicts. The government has essentially written IOUs totaling between $2.02 and $2.5 trillion for veteran medical care and disability payments that will continue through 2050. These costs increase annually as more veterans develop health problems related to toxic exposure, traumatic brain injuries, and psychological conditions that manifest years or decades after military service ended. Over 115,000 people have registered health conditions related to their presence at Ground Zero, the Pentagon, or the Shanksville crash site, with new cases appearing regularly as cancers and respiratory diseases develop slowly over time. Military families across America experienced disruption that extended far beyond the service members who deployed repeatedly to combat zones. Children grew up with parents absent for multiple year-long deployments. Spouses managed households alone, while partners served in dangerous locations thousands of miles away. Divorce rates among military families increased significantly during the height of combat operations. Communities with large military populations saw local economies fluctuate based on deployment schedules and casualty rates that affected morale and spending patterns. Healthcare systems in war zones suffered particularly severe damage that multiplied civilian casualty rates. Hospitals became military targets, medical supplies became impossible to obtain, and healthcare workers fled to safer locations. Pregnant women died in childbirth because clinics had closed. Children died from treatable diseases because vaccines and antibiotics were unavailable. Elderly people with chronic conditions like diabetes and heart disease died when medications ran out and replacement supplies could not reach them through combat zones. The economic devastation in countries where these wars occurred created humanitarian crises that persist years after combat operations ended. Afghanistan's economy collapsed completely following the American withdrawal, with international sanctions freezing government assets and creating widespread hunger. Iraq's infrastructure suffered damage that required decades and hundreds of billions in reconstruction funds. Syria's civil war, partially fueled by regional instability from the Iraq conflict, displaced millions of people and destroyed entire cities. Yet the war on terror's impact extended far beyond foreign battlefields and military casualties. The attacks that triggered this massive response had fundamentally altered American society itself, transforming how citizens lived, traveled, and interacted with their own government in ways that would prove just as lasting as any overseas military commitment. Homeland Security: How America Changed. The federal response transformed American society in ways that reached into every corner of daily life. The Department of Homeland Security emerged in November 2002 as the most significant reorganization of the federal government since the creation of the Department of Defense after World War II. This massive new bureaucracy absorbed 22 existing agencies and employed over 240,000 people by 2025, making it the third largest federal department. The Secret Service moved from Treasury to Homeland Security. Immigration services transferred from Justice. The Coast Guard shifted from Transportation. Emergency management functions consolidated under Federal Emergency Management Agency oversight. The USA Patriot Act passed through Congress just 45 days after the attacks with minimal debate, fundamentally altering the relationship between citizens and their government. Intelligence agencies gained unprecedented access to personal records, including phone calls, emails, financial transactions, and library borrowing patterns. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court began issuing thousands of warrants annually for domestic surveillance operations that had previously required extensive justification. National security letters, allowed FBI agents to demand personal information from banks, telecommunications companies, and internet service providers without judicial oversight. These expanded powers operated largely in secret, with recipients prohibited from disclosing government requests for their customers' private data. Airport security transformed from a relatively casual experience into a comprehensive screening process that treats every passenger as a potential threat. The Transportation Security Administration began operations in February 2002 with 56,000 employees responsible for screening over 2 million passengers daily across 440 airports. Current TSA statistics show that screeners confiscate approximately 6,000 firearms annually from passengers attempting to board commercial flights. The agency processes over 670 million passengers each year, while intercepting prohibited items ranging from weapons to oversized containers of liquids that might contain explosive materials. Passengers now arrive hours before flights to navigate metal detectors, body scanners, and manual searches that examine personal belongings item by item. Shoes come off after Richard Reed attempted to detonate explosives hidden in his footwear. Liquids face strict quantity limits following plots to use liquid explosives disguised as beverages. Electronic devices require separate screening because terrorists have hidden bombs inside laptops and phones. Each new threat produces additional security procedures that become permanent features of air travel. Immigration policies underwent revolutionary changes that affected millions of legal residents and visitors. The National Security Entry-Exit Registration System required certain non-citizens to register in person with immigration authorities and undergo periodic check-ins. Enhanced border security measures included additional agents, physical barriers, and electronic surveillance systems along both northern and southern borders. Visa applications required extensive background checks that could take months or years to complete. Students, workers, and tourists from certain countries faced additional scrutiny that often resulted in denial of entry or extended delays. Civil liberties advocates challenged many post-9/11 security measures in federal courts, arguing that surveillance programs violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. The Electronic Frontier Foundation filed dozens of lawsuits challenging warrantless wiretapping, data collection from internet companies, and location tracking through cellular phones. Some cases resulted in court decisions that limited government surveillance powers, but many programs continued operating under classified legal interpretations that remain secret from the public and most members of Congress. The financial cost of Homeland security measures reached $1.1 trillion between 2001 and 2025, representing one of the largest sustained government expenditures in American history. This spending encompasses TSA operations, border security enhancements, intelligence gathering capabilities, cybersecurity programs, and grants to state and local law enforcement agencies for terrorism prevention activities. Annual Homeland Security budgets exceed the total defense spending of most NATO countries, yet measuring the effectiveness of these investments remains extremely difficult because successful prevention often involves classified operations. Cybersecurity has become the fastest growing component of Homeland Security as adversaries shift from physical attacks to digital warfare. Nation-state actors routinely penetrate government networks, steal classified information, and disrupt critical infrastructure systems that control power grids, water supplies, and financial networks. The 2025 Homeland Threat Assessment identifies cyber attacks as the most serious long-term threat facing American security, requiring constant adaptation of defensive measures and international cooperation agreements. The threat landscape continues evolving in ways that challenge traditional security approaches developed after 9/11. Domestic violent extremists now pose greater statistical risks to Americans than international terrorist organizations. Climate change creates new vulnerabilities as extreme weather events overwhelm emergency response systems. Supply chain disruptions demonstrate how global interconnectedness can amplify local problems into national crises. Disinformation campaigns conducted through social media platforms influence elections and undermine public trust in democratic institutions. Some security measures implemented after 9/11 have clearly outlived their usefulness, while others remain essential for preventing catastrophic attacks. Airport shoe removal requirements capture few genuine threats, but create massive delays and inconvenience. Enhanced driver's license requirements prevent identity fraud, but impose costs on citizens who pose no security risks. The challenge facing policymakers involves distinguishing between security theater that provides psychological comfort and genuine protective measures that address real threats. After more than 2 decades of these transformations, fundamental questions remain about whether all these changes have actually made Americans more secure. Legacy and lessons, what we've learned. The deeper question involves what these security transformations have actually accomplished and whether they justify their enormous costs. No large-scale aviation attacks have succeeded on American soil since 9/11, suggesting that airport security measures achieved their primary purpose. Al-Qaeda's core leadership has been decimated through targeted killings and captures. The organization that once commanded global attention now operates as fractured regional affiliates with limited capability to coordinate spectacular attacks against American targets. Yet new forms of terrorism emerged from the chaos that followed American interventions. The Islamic State grew directly from the power vacuum created when the United States disbanded Iraq's military and excluded Sunni Muslims from political participation. Domestic violent extremists now kill more Americans annually than international terrorist organizations. Cyber attacks threaten critical infrastructure in ways that conventional security measures cannot address. The threat landscape has evolved beyond recognition from the clear enemy that attacked the Twin Towers and Pentagon. Military strategists learned painful lessons about the limits of American power during 2 decades of conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq. Technological superiority means nothing when enemies blend into civilian populations and wage asymmetric warfare using improvised explosive devices and suicide attacks. Cultural knowledge proved more valuable than firepower in environments where winning required understanding tribal politics, religious traditions, and historical grievances that shaped local loyalties. American forces could defeat any conventional army, but struggled to create legitimate governance structures that functioned without constant foreign support. The expansion from counterterrorism into nation-building revealed fundamental misunderstandings about how societies transform. Democracy cannot be imposed through military force on populations that lack the institutional foundations, cultural traditions, and social trust necessary for democratic governance. 20 years of effort in Afghanistan created a government that collapsed within weeks of American departure. Iraq required massive ongoing assistance to maintain basic stability despite billions invested in reconstruction and training programs. American foreign policy doctrine shifted dramatically as policymakers grappled with the consequences of preemptive war and unilateral action. The Bush doctrine's emphasis on preventing threats before they materialized led to interventions based on flawed intelligence and optimistic assumptions about post-conflict stability. The Iraq invasion damaged relationships with traditional allies who questioned American judgment and reliability. Intelligence agencies that had provided confident assessments about weapons of mass destruction lost credibility that took years to rebuild. The Obama administration attempted to refocus counterterrorism efforts through targeted operations using special forces and drone strikes rather than large-scale invasions. This approach reduced American casualties and financial costs while maintaining pressure on terrorist organizations. However, drone warfare raised new ethical questions about civilian casualties and the legal authority to conduct military operations in countries where the United States had not declared war. Geopolitical consequences from the War on Terror continue reshaping international relationships in unexpected ways. Iran expanded its regional influence as American forces removed hostile governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Russia exploited American distraction in the Middle East to reassert control over former Soviet territories. China used the period of American military engagement elsewhere to build economic relationships and military capabilities that challenge American dominance in Asia and the Pacific. Regional instability created by prolonged conflicts generated refugee crises that destabilized neighboring countries and strained international humanitarian resources. Syria's civil war, fueled partly by sectarian tensions unleashed in Iraq, displaced millions of people and contributed to political upheaval across Europe. Libya's collapse after NATO intervention created another failed state that became a source of weapons, fighters, and migrants affecting North Africa and the Mediterranean region. Expert assessments consistently identify intelligence failures, strategic overreach, and inadequate post-conflict planning as primary causes of the War on Terror's mixed results. The decision to invade Iraq diverted resources and attention from Afghanistan at the crucial moment when consolidating gains might have prevented Taliban resurgence. Disbanding Iraqi military and government institutions created unemployed enemies rather than cooperative partners. Relying on local allies whose interests diverged from American objectives guaranteed eventual conflicts that undermined mission objectives. Americans who came of age during the War on Terror developed fundamentally different attitudes toward military intervention than previous generations. They witnessed the human and financial costs of prolonged conflicts that achieved ambiguous results despite enormous sacrifices. Opinion polls showed declining support for overseas military commitments and increasing skepticism about the effectiveness of military force in achieving political objectives. This generational shift influences contemporary debates about defense spending, alliance commitments, and responses to international crises. The public's appetite for military intervention decreased dramatically as the costs of the War on Terror became apparent. Politicians who advocate for military action now face voters who remember the promises made about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction and Afghanistan's potential for democratic transformation. Veterans returning from combat zones often became voices for restraint rather than advocates for continued military engagement. Current security challenges require approaches that traditional military force cannot address effectively. Climate change creates humanitarian crises that generate political instability and population movements across international borders. Economic inequality and social fragmentation within democratic societies create vulnerabilities that foreign adversaries exploit through disinformation campaigns and cyber operations. Pandemic diseases spread faster than military responses can contain them, requiring international cooperation rather than national security measures. These lessons emerge from the most expensive and prolonged military commitment in American history, yet their implications extend far beyond defense policy. The fundamental assumptions that guided American responses to September 11th have been tested against reality and found wanting in ways that demand honest assessment of what 2 decades of conflict have actually achieved. The scale of this transformation becomes starkest when measured against its original purpose. Military power cannot build nations, democracy cannot be imposed at gunpoint, and security cannot be purchased through endless war. America spent $8 trillion and sacrificed over 900,000 lives pursuing enemies that multiplied faster than bombs could eliminate them. The teenagers boarding planes today were born into a world shaped by decisions made in the shadow of September 11th. They inherit surveillance states, traumatized veterans, and regional conflicts that continue burning across 3 continents. The next generation must navigate the consequences of choices they never made, in a world forever changed by one terrible morning.